Breaking news. The United States has announced the end of the war against Iran. But there's one detail that changes everything. What if this end isn't really the end, but a strategic move to exit a conflict without admitting defeat? Before we continue, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to understand can completely change the way you see modern wars and global political decisions. It all started when major international agencies like Reuters and the Associated Press reported that a White House official, directly linked to Donald Trump's administration, stated under anonymity that the United States considers hostilities with Iran to be over. The reason? Simple, at least in the official version. There have been no direct attacks between the two countries since the ceasefire established more than 20 days ago. At first glance, this seems logical. If there are no more bombings, then the war is over. But this is exactly where the problem begins, because in geopolitics, silence does not mean peace, it often means preparation. And the most important detail: Iran has not confirmed this end. There was no agreement, no treaty, no final negotiation. It was a unilateral decision. And when only one side decides the war is over, that doesn't end the conflict, it only changes the narrative. Now comes a point that almost no one is highlighting, but that is central to understanding all of this. The US government is relying on the War Powers Resolution, a law created in 1973 that allows the president to initiate military actions for up to 60 days without congressional approval. After that period, authorization is required to continue. And guess what is happening right now? That deadline is ending. In other words, the end of the war may not just be a strategic choice. It may be a legal obligation. This completely changes the scenario, because it shifts from a decision of victory to a necessity of exit. And when a power needs to leave a conflict without a clear victory, it resorts to the oldest strategy in international politics: controlling the narrative. Controlling the narrative. Declare the end, claim objectives were achieved, and reduce the perception of risk. But let's look at the facts objectively. There was no surrender from Iran, no nuclear agreement, no announcement of a decisive strategic victory. So what exactly was won? That's the question few are asking. Because while the discourse speaks of closure, the background suggests something very different. Information indicates that even after the announcement, there has been increased movement of US military equipment in the Middle East, and that is not a small detail. If the war is over, why reinforce military presence? The answer lies in deterrence logic. You don't attack, but you also don't fully withdraw, you remain ready. It's like saying, we stopped, but we didn't leave the game. And this reveals something even deeper. The war may have left its visible phase and entered a strategic phase. And this phase is far more dangerous, because it doesn't appear clearly in headlines. Now think about this. If one side declares the war over without agreement, if the other side does not confirm it, if there is continued military movement, and if there is legal pressure to end the conflict, what is the most logical conclusion? This is not exactly the end, it's a pause. A calculated pause, a necessary pause. A pause that allows forces to reorganize and the next move to be evaluated. And pauses, in the history of conflicts, are rarely permanent. They exist to prepare what comes next. And here's a point that changes everything. Modern wars are not fought only with bombs. They are fought with economics, politics, strategy, and narrative. And often, these forms are even more powerful than direct confrontation. So what we are seeing now may just be the transition from a military war to a silent war. So what we are seeing now may just be the transition from a military war to a silent war. And this transition is almost invisible to those who only look at headlines. But for those who analyze the context, it is extremely clear. And this leads us to a fundamental question: has the war really ended, or has it simply changed form? Because if it has changed form, the most critical moment may not have even arrived yet. And in the next chapter, you will understand exactly what is happening behind the scenes, and why this end may just be the beginning of something much bigger. While the world begins to believe that the war is over, behind the scenes tell a completely different story. A story of preparation, strategic calculation, and silent tension. Because in practice, nothing has been resolved. Iran has not recognized the end of the conflict. There was no formal agreement, no final negotiation, and that alone is already a major warning sign. In geopolitics, when there is no agreement, the conflict continues to exist, even if there are no shots being fired. And that is exactly what is happening now. A state of active suspension. It's not peace, it's not open war, it's something in between. And this in-between is one of the most dangerous scenarios that exist. Because any mistake, any incident, any misinterpreted move can reignite everything immediately. Now add another layer. The United States still maintains significant military presence in the region. That is not compatible with a full end of conflict. That is strategic positioning. That is deterrence. That is readiness for rapid response. That is readiness for rapid response. That is readiness for rapid response. At the same time, Iran continues to move politically, maintaining relationships, strengthening alliances, and making it clear that it is not isolated. This behavior is not from a country that believes the war has ended. It is from one preparing for the next chapter. And here comes a fundamental concept: control of time. When a country decides to end a conflict without resolution, it gains time. Time to reorganize, time to observe, time to adjust strategies. And time, in geopolitics, is power. Because whoever controls time controls the pace of the game. And controlling the pace means having an advantage. So this end of the war may actually be a way to redefine the rhythm, reduce intensity now to avoid exhaustion, while preparing the ground for future decisions. And that explains why military planning has not been abandoned. It still exists, ready to be activated if necessary. Now think about this. If both sides remain active, if there is military presence, if there was no agreement, and if planning continues, what really changed? The answer is simple and unsettling. Only the appearance of the conflict has changed. And this leads to a conclusion that many people still haven't realized. The war may not have ended. It has just become less visible, and invisible wars are harder to predict, harder to understand, and often more dangerous, because they create a false sense of security. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario that major changes happen without warning. Now that you understand what is happening behind the announcement, we reach the most important part: what could happen next? And the answer is not simple, but there are some clear scenarios. The first scenario is the most optimistic. The conflict remains at low intensity, without direct escalation, functioning like a regional Cold War. No constant direct attacks, but permanent tension. The second scenario is the most likely. An isolated incident reignites the conflict. It could be an indirect attack, a miscalculation, or a provocation, and within days, everything returns to previous intensity, or even higher. The third scenario is the most critical, a larger escalation involving other actors, expanding the conflict beyond what we have seen so far. And here is the key point: all these scenarios remain possible because nothing has been resolved. There was no agreement, no clear definition of victory, no resolution of the root causes of the conflict. And when the causes remain, the risk remains. At the same time, there is the political factor. For Donald Trump, ending the war may be a way to reduce internal pressure, improve public perception, and avoid political wear. But this also creates a risk. If the conflict returns, the narrative collapses quickly. On Iran's side, the strategy is clear. Do not officially recognize the end, maintain response capability, and choose the right moment to act, if it decides to act. This turns the conflict into a game of patience, and games of patience are won by those who make fewer mistakes. Now I want you to think about all of this. Are we really witnessing the end of a war, or just the interval between two of its phases? Because the answer to that question defines everything that may happen from here on. Leave your opinion in the comments below, because I want to know how you interpret this scenario. And if you want to keep understanding what is really happening in the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next move could happen at any moment, and you won't want to miss it.